Welcome back to Risk Management and Insurance. We'll start this unit out with a refresher on risk management and then discuss how it blends into enterprise risk management. As always, we will discuss insurance, but it is important to remember that insurance is just one of the techniques to use in a risk management or ERM program. The risk management process can be thought of as having 4 to 5 steps in it, depending on how they are defined. And these steps are, first, to identify the risks. Second, measure the potential costs of the risks. Third, select one or more techniques for treating the risks. Fourth, implement those techniques. And finally, monitor the success of those techniques and use a feedback loop to constantly update and improve your handling of risk. Risk is also ever-changing, and risk management cannot be a static event. Now, measuring the potential cost of risk can be one of the hardest things to do. One effective approach is to think of risks as falling into one of 4 boxes or quadrants measured across 2 dimensions of frequency and severity. So those 4 quadrants typically would be low frequency and high severity events, high frequency and high severity, low frequency and low severity, and high frequency and low severity events. So think of frequency as being across the x-axis and severity across the y-axis. And we'll come back to these quadrants in a bit. So based on the frequency and severity of each risk identified, we can then choose a technique to treat it. And those techniques or methods of handling risk are avoidance, loss control, retention, non-insurance transfers, and in insurance. Now, if you use insurance, you have to always, as a business, ask the question of whether or not insurance is a reliable asset. And we will come back to this question at the end of the lecture, and the answer may surprise you. So now that we've revisited risk management, let's now turn to enterprise risk management. And our textbook defines it as comprehensive risk management, a program that considers an organization's pure risk, speculative risk, strategic risk, and financial risk. The text also goes on to state that enterprise risk management combines into a single unified treatment program all major risks faced by the firm. So as a review of these different kinds of risk, pure risk is a situation where there are only the possibilities of loss or no loss. So property and casualty, health, life, short-term disability, long-term disability. Really, traditional insurance and also self-insurance programs can handle these. Departments that would typically be involved would be human resources, risk management, and perhaps even finance. Speculative risk, by contrast, is a situation where either there's profit or loss as possibilities. Think of things like commodity price risk, interest rates, currency exchange, and subcontracting. Departments involved here are usually finance and your international subsidiaries. Strategic risk refers to uncertainty regarding the organization's strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities, as well as threats. Departments that are going to be involved here could be marketing, operations, the executive suite, R&D, and probably finance. Operational risk. Risks that develop out of business operations, including such things as manufacturing products and providing services to customers. The departments involved typically would be sales, marketing, operations, production, possibly finance, and the senior executives as well as the board. ERM takes all these different risks and views them together. There are many benefits to this treatment of risk in one context, and one of the largest is that the organization can now consider what is the risk that something bad happens to speculative risk and operational risk at the same time, such as a large currency loss due to the exchange rate moves in your main overseas market at the same time that your U.S. plants are shut down due to a labor strike, or pure risk and strategic risk. Say your main factory is wiped out in a hurricane at the same time that a new competitor brings their products to market. While the company may be able to handle any one of these risks by itself, the potential combination of risks hitting all at once may necessitate a completely different management of the risks. Through ERM, you can gauge how bad a worst-case scenario really can be and plan for it even if it has never happened before. Now that we've begun to define enterprise risk management, or ERM, let's go back to the idea of quadrants of frequency and severity with the risk map exhibit that will be coming up shortly. As you can see, several different ERM risks are shown on the left-hand side of this exhibit, and they are mapped across the dimensions of frequency and severity. The typical manager will ask, how often is this going to happen? And if it happens, how bad will it be when it does happen? Using this risk map in ERM, the organization can then decide how best to treat a risk based on how often and how bad. Low frequency and low severity events and risks can be self-insured in operational budgets with some planning. Think of auto physical damage claims for companies with large fleets of vehicles. They will have accidents, and the financial impact on this part will be fairly small. High frequency and low severity risks can also be self-insured, but with more planning due to the potential cash flow implications. Examples of this are smaller workers' compensation claims for general contractors and large manufacturers. Products liability for automakers can even be treated in this fashion, though it often be capped with insurance on top of a self-insured retention. Now, the size of an organization also impacts its view of severity. A $1 million products claim may be small severity for one of the big three automakers, but it would be a catastrophic loss for one of their small suppliers. Moving up into the upper left quadrant, we have low frequency but potentially high severity risks such as shareholder lawsuits, which are considered under directors' and officers' liability. After a company, for example, has a large drop in its stock price, there are often shareholder lawsuits that name the directors and officers personally. And insurance is usually the vehicle for managing this risk. Finally, we have the upper right quadrant of high frequency and high severity. This is kind of the double whammy in ERM and risk management, a bad outcome and lots of them. So think of currency risk and severe products liability risks, such as a drug maker who finds out that the new blockbuster drug actually causes heart attacks and that several hundred people have died as a result. It's very hard to get insurance limits to cover the potential severity in an event like this. And as a result, companies spend a lot of time, energy, and resources trying to manage their risks in order to reduce their frequency and severity. And the treatment of these risks may actually move them from one quadrant into another, reducing their potential impacts. In some cases, however, a risk may be so severe that a company may simply avoid it by not going into that new product line or closing an operation. Just about any risk can be mapped out in this manner, and many companies use this approach to ERM. Let's now turn to a description of a sample ERM system or process from the July 2006 edition of Risk Management magazine. You would select the risks to be monitored by the system, not every risk, just the more important ones. You'd map the relevant relationships among risk drivers and strategic initiatives. You'd identify the various internal and external data sources that could provide timely risk information for the system. You'd define potential actions to mitigate those risks. You'd set priorities for the system's capabilities for suggesting relevant actions, escalating risk, and tracking risk management actions. In many ways, this is the traditional risk management process, but broadened for the larger context of total risk in an organization. Let's turn to a couple examples of how this can work in practice. Supply chain management for a manufacturer. You'd first profile your supply base, look at your raw materials, your parts, the logistics, energy sources, technology. You'd assess the vulnerability, the external, the environmental, and the internal vulnerability and threats. You'd evaluate the implications, kind of a baseline of frequency and severity, which would take us back to our risk map again. You'd identify the actions, perhaps the risk mitigation options and costs. You'd develop a decision model looking at your risk tolerance. What risks can you really accept as a company? You'd identify your best options, really on a return on investment basis. You'd look to gain management support for the initiative, create an implementation plan, and then implement the strategy. Sounds simple, right? It is simple on paper, but execution is the hard part. Let's now turn to a second example, and this one in the information technology or IT department. You need to develop an awareness of the nature of different IT risks to the business. And really, we're talking about cyber liability here. You have to quantify the impact to the business, understand the range of tools available to manage your IT risks. You need to align the costs of the IT risk management to the business value from them, and build a systematic corporate capability to manage your security risk. So let's think about it. Security. The threat is computer crimes, perhaps internal breaches, or cyber terrorism. So what about a breach of your computer system? What if somebody gets in and gets all of your clients' private data? This could be the credit card numbers, the social security numbers for your clients. You have to think about who gets access to your computer and your data. What happens if there's inappropriate use? You have to think about the availability. What happens in a system failure? What if there's human error? And what about redundancy within your system? When you think about cyber liability and threats and risk management, you also need to think about what if there's a crash to the system? How recoverable is your data, your hardware? What are the external threats? Natural disaster. What if there's a tornado that wipes out your building? You also need to think about the performance of your system. What are the peak periods of demand? And what is the scalability of your system? Where are the bottlenecks? Can your system handle new applications? What's the cost, the effectiveness? You also need to think about compliance with government regulations. You want to have good corporate governance in this arena. You want to have guidelines set out, internal policies. And every one of your identified risks needs to be treated in detail like this. And because of this, many ERM projects get weighted down in details and are not effective. In order to be effective and stay effective, organizations need to stay focused on just their top risks. Let's now turn to the definition of ERM that the Conference Board gives us. And they put out a study called The Role of U.S. Corporate Boards in Enterprise Risk Management in 2006. The Conference Board, as an organization, creates and disseminates knowledge about management and the marketplace to help businesses strengthen their performance and better serve society. Research has been done via McKinsey & Company and KPMG. And ERM, as defined by the Conference Board, as well as SEC regulation created under Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX Act, requires companies to design internal control and disclosure procedures according to a suitable recognized control framework. Specifically, the SEC recommends the use of the COSO 1992 internal controls and integrated framework. So the COSO's approach to managing financial fraud risks, where internal control is really a process that's affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel. Originally, it was limited to just the risk of fraud, but eventually was expanded and is defined in the following way: as affected by an entity's board, management, and personnel, applied in a strategy setting, designed to identify potential events that may affect the entity, designed to manage risks to be within the company's risk appetite, and able to provide reasonable assurance regarding achievement of entity objectives. Geared to the achievement of objectives in one or more separate but overlapping categories, and is a means to an end and not an end in itself. So what does that, and what does that not mean in context of what we've already discussed? Considerations to keep in mind are that risk management and enterprise risk management needs to be a process that is ongoing and flowing through an entity, and it's really affected by people at every level of the organization. It's not just the board, and it's not just the managers. It's applied across the enterprise at every level and every unit, and includes taking an entity-level portfolio view of risk. So ERM is designed to identify potential events that, if they occur, will affect the entity and to manage that risk within the entity's risk appetite. So how do organizations in the real world view the ERM process, and what are the different schools of thought? First theory is that ERM should not be an entirely new and separate infrastructure separate from the costly implementation of internal controls, procedures required by SOX. It should relate to existing financial and non-financial drivers of success. The alternate argument is that basing risk on predetermined performance criteria could really impair the company's ability to cast a wide enough net in identifying risk issues. The argument here is that ERM needs to be completely separate so as not to be blinded to emerging risks or risks that go across departments by simply relying upon the current definitions of risk and current structures in place to manage them. Regardless of which view of the world you subscribe to, some key steps in implementing an ERM system are relating drivers of performance to a company's stream of revenues and earnings, as well as its state of liquidity and vulnerability to a liquidity crisis. In order to go over this next point, let's bring up the next exhibit, which is the elements of a risk inventory. In this step, the drawing up of an inventory of risk factors pertaining to each driver's success is an alternate to the risk map, or can be a step in creating a risk map. Devising a heat map of earnings vulnerability across business units. So really this risk heat map and its implications is another way on this step on the way to a risk map. Arraying your earnings vulnerabilities and probabilities graphically to track potential effects of various risks, or risk map. And this next exhibit that you'll see is a second visual of the ERM process. So if we could put up exhibit 3 right now. And you can see that it's a never-ending loop of evaluation and management, just as any other management system. And this is especially important in today's environment given our ever-changing risk. The frequency and severity approach that we discussed in the risk map in conjunction with this process really helps to drive the focus onto the key risks. As you look at this exhibit, let's turn again to why an organization should utilize an ERM system. For larger companies, there are really 6 key reasons. The first is there were revised New York Stock Exchange listing standards that require listed companies' audit committees to discuss policies with respect to assessment and risk management, and more specifically, discuss major financial risk exposures and the steps management has taken to monitor and control such expenses. Secondly, the SEC's endorsement of self-regulatory frameworks to manage financial risk, the COSO. Third, SEC requirements to consider risk factors disclosure in annual and quarterly reports. Market demands also for periodic updates of risk may increase the pressure on the company to establish a comprehensive ERM infrastructure. And another more personal reason for senior executives, should anything go very wrong, in the amendments to the federal sentencing guidelines, there are provisions for more lenient treatment of corporate crimes if the organization had established a well-functioning qualifying compliance program. Best practice standards implemented in highly regulated industries such as banking and insurance may also lead to more universal adoption by industries not prone to develop a robust risk oversight process. And finally, the rating agencies are more attuned to companies' ERM systems. Moody's and Standard & Poor's have begun to incorporate risk management into their credit rating decisions. So as we talk about ERM and risks, I want to share some observations from some board members of publicly traded companies regarding risk and ERM. Here's one quote: "The full board clearly has oversight responsibility for strategy as well as ERM. The agendas for both are by management and approved by the full board." Directors repeatedly said that when it comes to risk management, tone at the top is critical. Without tone at the top, a company can never have enough auditors, lawyers, or compliance to make risk oversight work. Third quote: "In my role as a director, my job is to protect the interests of the shareholders, not to protect management. What boards must ask is the what-if questions." Another quote is, "Most board members believe that risk management should be second nature for executives, i.e. their decisions should take into account how significant risks should be managed." These are pretty powerful statements on risk and risk management and ERM. As part of any risk management or ERM program, the cost of risk has to be quantified. It is part of the severity measure, and it gets at the basic concept of planning and budgeting that all organizations must do. First, let's define cost of risk. It represents the extent to which an organization's value has been reduced by its risk. Cost of risk measurements include both the current cost of risk and how the cost of risk has changed. So key components of cost of risk are the expected cost of losses, which is expected loss frequency times loss severity. Also the cost of loss control, the cost of risk reduction and the limits of risk reduction on risky activity. The cost of loss financing, this includes the cost of self-insurance, insurance, and transaction costs. The cost of internal risk reduction, these would be transactional costs, the employee's salaries, benefits, etc., and costs to obtain and analyze loss data. The cost of residual uncertainty, this includes the effect of uncertainty on the price of the firm's products and the price of the firm's stock. And traditional measures of these splits of costs would be 68% of the cost of loss would be loss costs, and 32% would be fixed costs, expenses of the organization. And these are just the identifiable and budgeted costs of risk. Most insurance and risk management experts will tell you that there are hidden costs of risks, and they're going to include the lost time of injured employees, the time lost by other employees who are distracted by injuries and accidents, time lost by supervisors and managers and executives when dealing with risk and losses, incidental costs from lost production, such as lost bonuses and failure to meet contractual obligations, the ongoing wages for the injured employees, salary continuation benefits, lost profit on the injured employee's productivity, such things as decreased employee morale. But now let's assume that your company does everything right. Your board supports risk management and ERM, your departments all work together to identify your major risks, and you have a great program of treating each risk in a cost-effective and efficient manner. Life is good. What could possibly go wrong? Asbestos, it's one thing that could possibly go wrong. Pollution, it's another. Chinese drywall, silicosis, you name it. There are many mass torts out there. But wait, you say you have insurance for those really big and bad losses. The insurance company will take care of it, right? Well, what if your insurance company goes bankrupt and is not around when the lawsuit comes in? The financial strength of your insurance company should be the first question that you ask, even before the question of what is the price and the coverage. Many companies have found out the hard way that the insurance company is not always going to be around, and as an organization, you need to be careful who you buy insurance from. Let's now turn to an exhibit by AM Best, which is a rating company that evaluates the strength and operational strength of insurance carriers. Most agents and brokers and commercial insurance buyers look at the AM Best ratings of companies when deciding which insurance companies to consider using. Many larger organizations have minimum rating standards that they use, such as a minimum rating of A-, which you can see corresponds to an excellent rating. Now, keeping in mind that insurance companies can and do go bankrupt, let's turn to a series of insurance limits exhibits from a heavy manufacturing company. Many Midwest manufacturing companies have had to spend a lot of time and money creating exhibits such as these when they have become targets of mass torts. Each color represents a different insurance carrier, and each block represents a single or multiple years of coverage for a single policy. You can see as the years went by, this company bought more insurance coverage and had to use more carriers in order to fill out their limits. The dotted blocks represent self-insurance. And it's interesting to note that in 1986 and 1987, the company was not able to get any insurance at a price that they were willing to pay. This was the period of time where the insurance crisis first started, when we started to have multi-million-dollar judgments popping up, and insurance carriers had to cancel many of their insureds in order to stay solvent. Some companies cannot get insurance at any price. So whether this company is exposed to pollution claims or asbestos claims, let's imagine that there are thousands of claimants with hundreds of millions and potentially billions of dollars of claims from the last 60 years. Let's now turn to the next exhibit. The red color shows the carriers that went bankrupt. An insurance company's bankruptcy does not mean that there is no coverage, but it means that as a company, you have to get coverage from the State Guarantee Fund. And they may deny your claim if they consider your balance sheet to be too large. There are often very few funds left in these cases, and the state guarantee funds want those dollars to go to the smaller and less sophisticated insureds who cannot afford to self-insure their claims. So let's just say that it's become doubtful that these blocks are available for paying claims for you. Let's turn to the next exhibit now. This exhibit adds in those insurance companies that have seen their ratings dropped to NR or C++. This is not good news and often happens on the way to bankruptcy. So we have more millions of dollars in limits that are probably not available to this company. Let's go to the next and final exhibit. This exhibit adds in another measure of financial strength rating of the insurance companies who have insured this company. This measure is the rating of the insurance carrier's parent company's senior debt of BB or BBB+. While this is not the same thing as the AM Best rating of the insurance carrier's ability to pay its claims, it is a clear signal from the credit markets that there are potential problems for the company and that may ultimately impact the insurance company's ability to pay its claims. So what is the bottom line? There is no end to risk. Even when you have done your best job possible, you still may have a problem down the road that will undo your risk management or ERM plan. Which brings us back to the idea that ERM is a process that is always ongoing. With that in mind, we will turn to workers' compensation in the next unit. Workers' compensation claims can and do at times pay out over very long periods, up to 30, 50, and even 70 years, depending on when the employee was injured, how old the employee was, what the injury was, and how long the employee lives. So I look forward to talking to you about workers' compensation in Unit 6. Thanks.